Today we are very fortunate. Our guest is Dr. Kitty Poterack. Our subject is child abuse. We're going to turn this over to Kitty because she's loaded with magnificent information.
Thank you for having me, Rebecca.
Thank you so much
Thank you for taking this on, too. It's not a comfortable subject, but it's something that we can't afford to ignore. You know, as a community, as individuals, as a nation, it affects all of us. Even if we don't see it directly happening, it still affects all of us. And I'm glad for the opportunity to address it here.
Explain to me why it is so important to address this subject now.
Yes, because it impacts the now and our future. Our future as a community, as a nation, the future of individuals too, you know, who've had their potential cut short because of the violation of a very basic contract. You know, the contract to protect our children, the contract to love them and raise them and give them the confidence they need to reach their potential, to become, you know, the human beings that they were meant to be, and to, in turn, you know, raise their families, raise their children. It's not enough to have ideals, but then ignore when those ideals are not being met. It affects us all, and it's a vicious cycle too, because the pain that happens inside a child, it stays inside them and affects everything they do, and it needs to come out. And even the person who thinks they have the most self-control still reacts because of that pain, sometimes surprisingly. Sometimes they surprise themselves. They find themselves hitting their child, or being self-destructive, or having problems with their relationships. So it's not enough to say it's wrong and you shouldn't do it. We really need to, when we find it, address it and stop it and understand that it's coming from a place of pain. And until you address that pain, you can't fix it. And we're addressing it in all the wrong ways. In some ways we're validating it because we don't want to fix the perpetrator. We try to keep the child out of harm, and a lot of times we even fail at that. You have to address why a parent would want to harm their child. It's a violation. It's a violation of the most basic human contract. And if we validate it by ignoring it, it's going to go on and on and on. And the child, as I said, that's harmed will grow up with that pain, and then that pain will come out in destructive ways later on. And then those individuals that are affected will perpetuate it. So what kind of problems need addressing and how are we going to do it? And we're speaking in terms of child abuse. Exactly. Well, the first thing is to recognize what it is. Unfortunately, we've had a societal norm that was condoned of corporal punishment. Some people, espouse the, spare the rod, spoil the child. And I think we've had a very basic misunderstanding of the effects of corporal punishment, even when, it is condoned. It doesn't address teaching a person self-control. It doesn't address helping a child understand why some behaviors are destructive or are not in their best interest. It just tells the child there's this authority over you And if you don't do what that authority says, you're going to feel... Human beings are most motivated by positive reinforcement. They are somewhat motivated by negative reinforcement. But a lot of times what negative reinforcement accomplishes is, one, making a person go into hiding about their activities. And we see that even in all levels of society, with adults too. But it also doesn't help a child understand the consequences of what the behavior would do, if they were left to do it. And it also doesn't, it harms a child's self-esteem. It harms a child's feelings of confidence and self-control. I agree. There are two ends of the extreme on this too. I mentioned positive reinforcement, but it is possible to swing the pendulum too far and to teach a child that anything is acceptable and it will be rewarded. It's also possible to teach a child that their self-esteem comes, from material rewards or getting their, wants met without considering the wants of others. At the other end, severe corporal punishment. Well, there is a line where it crosses into abuse. Nothing should ever leave a mark on a child. That doesn't teach them anything, and it harms them physically and psychologically. But corporal punishment in and of itself does not teach a person to self-regulate, to understand that their choices have consequences other than, pain when they don't do as they're told. It doesn't teach them to self-regulate. And then it creates this internal pain that lingers on. It never goes away. And it comes out later in self-destructive ways or projected onto others. It's a fact of the human psyche. We can only contain our internal pain so much. And even those of us with the best self-control, sometimes it simmers to the point that those people that feel they have willpower and are very controlled will act in the most destructive ways when they just can't take it anymore, when it's built up and they have not been given the skills to cope with life and to cope with the challenges life brings to all of us. So, veering from that though, child abuse is its own beast. It is not necessarily punishment with the intention of teaching, and again, corporal punishment is just one form of punishment. There are others that are, but child abuse is not punishment. Child abuse is rage. Child abuse is internal pain that is taken out on the most vulnerable human. It causes physical damage, obviously, and sometimes extreme physical damage. As a physician, that's certainly what I've dealt with. There is nothing a child could do that merits a fractured bone or a bleed inside their brain. It's rage that's inflicted on them, and apart from the physical effects, the psychological damage is tremendous. They are told, essentially, that they are at fault for someone else's pain, that they need to be hurt and punished because they take what happens to them and feel responsible. They internalize it. They feel that they are the guilty ones, not only, for what's happening to them, but for the rage and anger and pain that is in their caregiver, in their parent. It breaks the most fundamental of human contracts. I can't emphasize that enough. When that contract is broken, a person grows up insecure. They don't have a sense of self-esteem. They don't feel they're good enough. They don't feel that they deserve the things that truly are all human rights. The right to the pursuit of happiness, the right to achieve, their potential, the right to grow up whole and psychologically healthy, and one day have a life, that is of their choosing. that they won't, because of the pain inside them, end up destroying or disrupting children of their own who will grow up healthy because their parents grew up healthy and not with values that validate internal guilt. I should say inflicting pain is a way of expressing one's emotion or taking out one's rage. It's probably one of the most destructive things that we as human beings do to one another. Ignoring it, validating it, just perpetuates it. There are better ways to raise our children. There are better ways to understand that if someone abuses, it's not enough to call them out on it. It's important to examine why that behavior came from them and to try to address it. It's also important to teach us. In school we learn, writing, arithmetic, the 3 R's as they say, but we're not taught how human beings should treat one another. We're not taught how to self-regulate, how to behave in ways that are productive. It's kind of expected of us. We just kind of take some things for granted. And we're not taught those things, and in some ways we've been taught the wrong things. It's like with corporal punishment. It's important for a child to learn that all through life you have to make choices, and you will bear the consequences of your choices. Parents can teach that when they see a child making good choices. They can validate it. They can say, "Oh, I'm so happy about what a good job you did today. You did your homework, or you put your clothes away. You made your bed. You were a really helpful person in our family. Let's have some fun because you did such a good job. We've got time to have fun together, to talk, and when a child doesn't quite follow the rules, within reason, I think it's good to allow them to experience the natural consequences of what happens when they don't follow the rules. If you don't do your homework, you get a bad grade, or you don't get to, if your grades aren't good enough, you don't get to go along the class field trip. Obviously within reason, but we need to allow a child to develop those skills as we raise them, so that when they are finally out of the house, they have learned good decision-making skills. They have learned that choices have consequences, positive and negative. I think our society sort of puts child rearing on the back burner. Parents, especially in our economy, often need to work 2 jobs. The children often, leave very early in the morning with the parents and are dropped off at daycare before school, and then spend the day at school, and then have daycare after school. And then by the time they see their parents, the parents are exhausted and really can't focus all their energies on a child. Pretty much the family is just going into, their routine to begin the whole process over and over again the next day. I think we need to support good parenting. I think we need to also, as a culture, not make it so much pressure to make a living that supports, all our wants, whatever. And again, when mom and dad are so exhausted from each having their job and lose time with their children, the children kind of get pushed aside, and they don't get to see their parents sometimes in the positive light, or as much positive light. Parenting is the most difficult and important job that we do as a culture, and a lot of times we don't get that message. We are, validated for our success at our jobs, or, our professions, or our, individual accomplishments. But often not recognized for the time and effort we put in raising our children. Children's self-esteem is harmed when they see the person who's most important to them act as if their time is not as important as all the other pursuits, or seeing their parent frazzled and exhausted, being told by their parent, I'm too tired, I don't have enough time for you, having a parent snap at them because they're so tired at the end of the day that they can't tolerate anything less than complete obedience for a child. Or at the other extreme, they're so tired at the end of the day that they just don't care what's happening with the child. They're content to let the child, play in their room, ignore them, go off and do other things, while they are not spending active time parenting the child. And that does send a message. Our actions speak louder than words. A child learns that they are lower on the totem pole when they see their parents prioritize other things. And again, that creates a place of pain in a child. A place of pain that is internalized, that stays there. When it needs to come out, it's expressed in negative ways. It gets expressed as school failure, or as getting into fights with their peers, or as they get older, breaking laws, or starting to engage in self-destructive behaviors like substance abuse or premature sexual activity. And that's another thing. A lot of times the destructive behaviors that children get into, especially as they get older, are ways of coping and acting out the pain that was instilled in them by their parents. I mean, either actively through physical abuse or passively through neglect. Neglect is in some ways worse or just as bad as physical abuse. It harms a child. It harms the psyche of a child. It may not leave marks externally, but it leaves internal damage. And then that goes on to be perpetuated in the child's experiences when the child becomes an adult, in their families, in their relationships with their partners. So as a society, we really, really, really need to address the importance of parenting our children. We were talking about the attention a child needs. And when a child doesn't get that attention, they will seek it out in other ways. If they learn that negative behavior gets them the attention they want, they will engage in negative behavior. If mom and dad ignore them, when they're quiet and, off on their own, or if mom and dad sort of shush them when a child comes up and wants to discuss their concerns or just interact with mom and dad, the child will get the message, okay, good behavior gets me nowhere, but negative behavior gets me what I want, which is any kind of attention. And then they apply that same principle outside of the home too. They apply it in school, they apply it in their friendships. As they get older, they apply it in acquiring friends and people who engage in the negative behavior with them, or they instill it in others. And again, a lot of that comes because of the pain that our behavior creates in our children. Neglect leaves a huge hole in a child's heart, perpetuates that. And we get into that sort of rut of behavior too. Without even realizing it sometimes, we just react to our children when they're doing what we don't want them to do. And we forget that, first of all, we need to react when our children are doing things that are good and productive and healthy for themselves. And we also need to just plain interact with our children. We brought them into the world. They are here by our choice. They're the greatest responsibility we ever have in our life. But we also have to recognize that they're the greatest joy we have in our life. That raising a child is a reward in and of itself. And a child, the thing they want most is to have a good relationship with their caregiver. We know through recent studies that caregivers impact children immensely. When trauma happens to a child, a good caregiver relationship has been demonstrated to ameliorate the harm, to make it less. Conversely, a poor caregiver-child relationship does the opposite. It intensifies the trauma and makes it worse. So we need to integrate our children into our lives, to show them the joy that we have in interacting with them, to share our experiences with them, to want to listen to their experiences, to answer their questions, because they are a new person, a new brain, a font of curiosity. They're learning about the world. They trust their parent, their caregiver, the most of all, to answer those questions. And sometimes it's very hard, it's true. When you're tired at the end of the day, it's hard to be patient. But it's the most important thing you can do. The parent-child bond is the most basic of human contracts. And the most important aspect of that is trust. A child comes into the world helpless. Human beings, we give birth to probably the most helpless of offspring as opposed to other creatures. And part of that is because the human brain needs that time in childhood to develop and become a whole adult. And in order to do that, a child needs to feel secure, and a child needs to trust his caregivers, her parents. If that trust is broken through either neglect or through pain, a child loses their sense of self-confidence. A child loses that sense of security, and they don't feel confident as they go out in the world. If anything, they feel inferior. They feel inferior to the other children whom they perceive as worthy of what they are not getting. As adults, they feel inferior. They did not get what they perceive the other people in their society or in their community have gotten. Of course, none of us are privy to other people's lives, but that's the perception of a child. And when that trust is broken, when a parent doesn't have enough time, or when a parent turns on a child to express their own rage on that child, it's almost dehumanizing in a way. It's a brain that grows up with a no conscience of itself as less than, as not as good. And again, that feeling, that sense of loss of self-confidence, that sense of internal pain is a vicious cycle. It spirals because then the person that feels less than doesn't take good care of themselves, sometimes actively harms themselves, sometimes takes out that pain in negative ways in our culture, through crime, through substance abuse, through abusing others. And it perpetuates and grows. It's an exponential thing. It draws other people in, the people who are maybe, the innocent bystanders, although a lot of time people who find themselves in abusive relationships are acting out their own loss of self-esteem and their own pain. It's not enough to say, this is not good. An abuser is a terrible person. Of course, abuse is terrible. But we need to look and see, why is the abuser abusing? Where did this come from? You're not going to solve this problem by slapping a Band-Aid on the abuser or by pointing fingers and negativity. Of course we don't condone the behavior. Of course we want to keep a child safe. We want to take a child out of a context in which they're being abused. But we need to look at the root causes of why this is happening. The subconscious message that our culture gives, that parenting is not necessarily the most important job in the world, that success is not necessarily measured by being a great parent and raising healthy and whole children. We send messages subconsciously and sometimes overtly that success comes from being great at your job, or from being a super athlete, or from making lots of money, or having lots of material success. Or success comes, from achieving professional things. It's not to say that those aren't successful things, but those are not the only successful things, and they should not supersede the role of parenting. The role of parenting should be supported and held at the top of the totem pole, because it affects all of us. And when it's done right, it helps all of us. It lifts us up. When it's done wrong, it does incredible damage, immeasurable damage, really, because I think a lot of us don't even really want to lift up the rock and see what's going on. Child abuse is all around us, and it's natural for us to want to shy away from painful subjects. But unfortunately, the blind eye actually perpetuates the problem and makes it worse. You can get on the internet and get the statistics, but the numbers are just part of the story. And I suspect the numbers are much higher than we even know, because we don't want to look there. And our social welfare systems are overwhelmed, again, because I think we do not want to go and address the root causes. And so the problem expands exponentially. People who grow up who abuse substances and become parents, a lot of that affects their children negatively. Those children grow up and have problems. It's an exponential thing. And we need to look and re-examine how our society, how our communities address the problem. Of course the social welfare systems are overwhelmed. They're dealing with this a case at a time. And cases are increasing because we have not fixed the problem. The way we deal with child abuse is dysfunctional. We deal with it a case at a time, rather than trying to identify the root causes and make changes in what we do. We stigmatize the people that stand up and shout, and sometimes the child itself is stigmatized for coming forth what's going on. They get subconscious messages from their parents who are pained to see that this child is being abused. Most abuse too occurs within the family, within relatives. There's a stigma associated with admitting you've been abused for the child, and there's a stigma for the family. And then sometimes too, the pain is so great that discovering that a child has been abused elicits anger in the parent, or feelings of shame. Families try to cover up, try to hide it. In our culture too, even though we pay lip service to castigating the people that abuse, or covertly we look down on it. Denigrating people does not solve the problem. It forces it further into hiding. So thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and having
My pleasure.
the time and the courage and the wisdom. It's marvelous.
Oh, I don't feel courageous. I feel, if anything, frustrated, because I don't see us addressing this problem in the way it should be addressed.